Good morning. All right, so we are on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, page 28, and we're learning this Mishnah and Gemara about the mats that were used for either shchiva, resting on, lying on, or they were used for schach. It seems like that's what the two purposes are. It seems to me that today a lot of these mats are used for maybe fencing, but doesn't seem to be even mentioned over here about the fencing part. It's either shchiva or sikoch. And although we did have a Gemara earlier that whenever you have a fence, sometimes you could use the word sikoch for a fence. There was such a Gemara where it talked about what was in Machlokes really in the Gemara. So where it talked about the paroiches was there was it uses the word it was masachech, uses such a word. But in any event, our Mishnah is dealing with the problem of if something is used for shchiva, for lying on, it falls under the category of mekabel tumah. It's susceptible to tumah. And the reason it's susceptible to tumah is because it doesn't fall into the regular rules of tumah. The regular rules of tumah is a flat wooden item. The flat wood is not susceptible. It's not a receptacle. And of course, there's a discussion about rabbinically if it's susceptible to impurity or not. But biblically, it's not susceptible to impurity. However, if you lie on it and you put your weight on it and so on, you sit on it, that would be fall under a unique category called Tumas Mishkav and Moishav. It's also called Tumas Medris. It's a Tumah of one lying on something or sitting, riding on something that's used for that purpose. It would fall under that category of Tumah. And what comes out is that it's not kosher for schach. So we've got these different mats, and we got to figure out what the halacha is. Are they going to be kosher for schach or not? So the Mishnah had said, and the Mishnah was a little vague because the Mishnah talked about very extreme cases, meaning here you had in mind you're making it or you're using it for schach, and here you're having in mind you're using it for shchiva, lying on. But the Mishnah seemed to leave out the typical case where you have nothing in mind, or the vague case where you didn't clearly have anything in mind. The Mishnah left that out, and the Gemara is dealing with how to figure out what is the law when it comes to a case that's not so spelled out. You didn't specify. Now, another thing that has to be mentioned here is that who does it go by? The wording of the Mishnah sounds like it goes by the person who makes it. Asa l'shchiva, it's made for lying on. And so from the wording of asa, it sounds like it goes by the person who makes it, not the one who buys it. But it's not so simple. Rashi translates asa l'shchiva not to be that you made it, but you were meyached it. You set it aside for that. So the commentaries talk about a person who buys it from a manufacturer. So the some right that you go after the manufacturer because he's the one who made it, and however, others right that you go after the person who buys it and he sets it aside for what he's going to use it for. The person who makes it doesn't care what you're going to use it for, so he has in mind anything as long as you buy it from him. He just wants you to buy it. So his intent is not really an intent. Maybe he doesn't even have intent clearly. And they seem to understand Rashi to mean that it goes by the person who buys it, what he just designates it for. That would be who calls the shots. That would be the final say. So what it seems to so we're going to learn that it goes by the person who buys it, even though the wording sounds asa l'shchiva, sounds like the person who made it, but there doesn't seem to be it seems like the opinions and the commentaries want to learn that it's really it goes by the buyer. So
Well,
that's
both arguments are reasonable, because
right.
if you're applying the idea that the intent is important and soaks into the schach somehow or whatever, then what it was made for, if there's a thought process there, that would count. I think what the Gemara is saying is, well, ultimately, it's what it's ultimately used for. It's not that you can't consider what it was made for, but it's ultimately, what did you do with it? And you can go either way.
Right. So the thing is that there is it seems and the commentaries struggle with this, is that there's the common opinion is that it goes by the buyer, but there is one other view, and it's not that it goes by the one who made it. It goes by what's the common the minhag hamakom.
The usage.
They go by what is the common minhag of the place. And they struggle to explain it that with that opinion. That's the way the Rush learns it, but it's somewhat of a struggle, because what does it really mean? How do you deal with the stomach case? How do you deal with the intermediate case? I mean, what's the minhag of the place, unless you say there's no minhag. There's no minhag, so that would be in other words, if there's a minhag of the place, then you go by the minhag. If there's no minhag of the place,
you back to where you started.
So then that's where the Gemara is dealing with. That's what it seems like, that would be the meaning of that. Or it's a place where you use it for both, Anyway, so that would be the other way of learning it. So it's not that anyone holds it goes by the one who made it, even though the wording in the Mishnah sounds like it goes by the one who made it. But it's either you go by the one who buys it and what he designates it for, or you go by what the minhag hamakom is. And that's the way the Rush seems to learn, and the Torah wants to paskin that way. Okay, so anyway, getting back to what the Mishnah said. So the Mishnah had two opinions. We have the first opinion, and then we have Rabbi Eliezer. The first opinion is generally understood as the Chachamim, and the Mishnah talked about a kanim machzelos kanim gedola, the big machzelos, the big mat, and it mentioned that you had in mind specifically for lying on it. So then it's going to be makabel tumah. You can't obviously you can't use it then for schach. It's invalid. How about if you had in mind for sikoch, you're having in mind to use it as shade? So then it's you could use it for schach. It's no problem. It's not makabel tumah. There's no tumah that it's shayach to be. It can't receive tumah. And Taisus is bothered with a big problem. He says, "Oh, so you go by these different types of tumah, like tumas medris, tumas mishkav v'maishav." Taisus says, What about tumas oil? You're using it for sikoch? It's makabel tuma. It's a tumas oil. It becomes tame, right? But you now have another type of tuma. So how does it help if it's using it for sikoch? Taisa says. So Taisa says no. It's actually not makabel tuma. Only if it's made out of pishtan, linen. There's only certain types of items that are tents that receive tuma when the impurity is under them. Not all items that are tents are susceptible to tuma. And there's a limit. I think it's something like Zera Shava or something, how they learn it. They learn from the Mishkan. All right, that's how it's learned from the Mishkan. It's Zera Shava learned from the Mishkan. And it's a Gemara in Shabbos, basically. It's learned from the Mishkan. How would the roof of the Mishkan, how was it made? So because there was linen and there's wool and there's I think goat hairs and leather. So those are things that are susceptible to tuma when they're an oil, when they're a tent. So those were the different coverings that the Mishkan had, right? It had Urias Izim, and it had Iris Choshim, Iris Elam Adamim, and Iris Choshim. So it had these type of materials. Those are makabel tuma. They are susceptible to impurity if they're tents, but not regular reeds. Reeds of regular wood is not makabel tuma. The only thing that grows from the ground that's a tent that will be susceptible to tuma is pishtan, which is flax or linen. And we learn it from the Mishkan. So basically, if you use it if you have in mind, designate it for sikoch, then it'll be kosher for schach. You had in mind for shriva, then you have the problem. It's susceptible to tuma because it's susceptible to the impurity of medras. And now, of course, people get turned. They fall asleep or their brain shuts down when you start talking too much about tuma. But just to make it very simple, seeing things that are susceptible to impurity are invalid for schach, and the laws that we're seeing that are applicable here are things that are used for lying on or for sitting or riding on. Those things are susceptible to impurity no matter what, even if they're flat, even if they don't have a receptacle, they are susceptible to impurity. It's called tumas medris, and basically a zav, a zava, a nida, ledas, if they sit on these type of items, or if they lie on these items, the item becomes as tameh as they are. And as they become an avatuma, special law tumas, the medris, that it gives it's a strong impurity that it takes on the same level of impurity as the one who as the thing that touches it, the person who touches it. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, isn't it throughout Shas, there's that when it comes to Tumas Medras, and if it's something like where it could say like be based on the intention or whatever, or somebody, or let's say like somebody is sitting on something that wouldn't normally be sat on, there's a principle that you could say to the person, get up and let me do my job.
Right. Amoid v'nasa malachtenu. Right. In other words, the item, it's not just if you sit on it, if it's made for sitting on. That's the point. That's what you're bringing out. It's not, it doesn't depend on what they sit on. It depends on if it's made for sitting on. Then they sit on it. Then it becomes tamei. Right. Correct. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So it's not just anything that a zava nida your ledas. It's not just anything that they sit on. It's only something that's made for that. And so that's what we have here. If it's made for, and not just made for it, it's designated for it. And I was, well, if you're the owner and you make it for that, then you've designated for that. But if it's bought in a store, so it doesn't matter what the manufacturer had in mind. It matters what you designate it for, at least according to those commentaries. So you make it for shchiva, then it's invalid for schach. If you made it for sikuch, then it's valid for schach. And as I mentioned, as long as it's not linen or flax. Now, Rabbi Eliezer says it doesn't matter if it's big or small. It goes by what you have in mind. Now, the problem is that sounds very similar to the first opinion. So the Gemara is going to deal with that as well. Like, what is the argument? I mean, it goes by what you have in mind, right? So if you have in mind for shchiva, if you have in mind for sikuch, these are the two main words over here: shchiva or sikuch. Shchiva means to lie on, or sikuch is for shade. And the Gemara first deals with the problem that you left out the implication cases that seem to contradict each other. You say you have to have in mind for shchiva to make it invalid for schach. So then if you didn't have anything in mind, it should be kosher. But then you say, in order to make it kosher for schach, you have to have in mind for sikuch. That sounds like the vague case where you don't have anything in mind. That sounds like that case would be invalid for schach. So you have a contradiction of the implication. And the Gemara wanted to answer Halai Kasha. The first Gemara is the answer. The Gemara tried to answer it and said, well, there's a difference if it's Katana or Gedola. If it's big, a big mat, or a small mat. And the Mishnah started off talking about a big mat, and the second case of the Mishnah, the way at least Rashi learns, is that if it's a small mat, so then you specifically have to have in mind for sikuch, for schach, in order for it to be a kosher. Otherwise, a small mat is automatically going to be invalid for schach. Now, what is a big mat? What is a small mat? What is the measure? How do you measure that? So the commentaries bring down from Shulchan Aruch, from commentaries in Shulchan Aruch, Kuri Yaakov, it's on the side of the Shulchan Aruch. So he says that a small mat is something that someone would lie on, which is the height of a person and a drop more. If it's bigger than that, that's called a big mat. If it's that size or less, that's a small mat. So it basically is based on a person's, it's based on the size of a regular person, and maybe a drop bigger, that would be small. So what comes out from here is the way the Gemara is understanding the Mishnah is that the Mishnah starts off talking about a big mat, and then it jumps to a case of a small mat. And the big mat, what is the law with when it's vague, when you don't have any clear designation, you didn't designate it for anything specific? So in that case, if it's a big mat, we assume that it's for sikuch, that it's kosher for schach, it's meant for shade, not going to be susceptible to impurity. It's good. What about a small mat? A small mat, as you see from the size of it, it's meant for lying on and sitting on, putting your weight on. That's what it's meant for. It's meant for that. Then it's susceptible to tumas medrus. That's the exact case of tumas medrus. And if so, it is invalid for schach unless you have specific intention for sikuch. Now, Tosfos doesn't seem to want to learn this way, that when the Gemara says the first is for Gedola, the second case is that one is Gedola, one is, here is a large mat, here is a small mat. Tosfos doesn't seem to want to translate it like Rashi translated it. So, that it fits exactly into the Mishnah. And therefore, Tosfos says, it's not that the Reisha is one case and the Seifa is the other case, but rather in the Reisha, the beginning of the Mishnah, it emphasizes that if you have in mind for shchiva, for lying on, any type of mat is going to be considered invalid for schach, and it's not specifying what type of mat it is, but it's emphasizing that no matter what type of mat it is, there are mats that are meant for siko, for shade. But if you have in mind, even those mats, if you have in mind for lying on, then it'll be considered, we go by what you have in mind. And then the Mishnah mentions the other case that osan l'sikoch, if you have in mind for sikoch, no matter what type of mat it is, even mats that we assume are for lying on, if you have in mind for shtiva, it's going to be if you have in mind for sikoch, if you have in mind for shade, it's going to be kosher for schach. So it's not that the Reisha and the Seifa specifically these cases. It's talking just more in general. But where is the chidush? The chidush would be in those specific cases that it's saying that even though there are cases where no matter what you have in mind, we assume this. I'm sorry, that if you don't have anything in mind, we assume one way. Even in those cases, if you have in mind something specific, we go by what you have in mind. So that's the way Tosfos wants to learn. And I think the reason why Tosfos wants to learn that way is because the Mishnah in the second half doesn't spell out that it's talking about Gedola or Katana. The second half, it just leaves it vague. So therefore, I think that's maybe why Tosfos doesn't want to say that the Reisha is Gedola, the Seifa is Katana, because in the Seifa it doesn't say what it is. So Tosfos wants to leave it more like the Mishnah is just talking in general, and it happens to apply to a small mat. But it's not only mentioning a small mat, it's mentioning in general. If you have in mind for sikoch, it's good for schach. If you have in mind for shade, it's going to be good for schach. Now it happens to apply, that law happens to apply much even in a case of where it's a small mat and it's meant really for lying on. That would be the main innovation of that law. That would be where it sticks out, where it's unique, where it adds something, because otherwise in the other case, even if you didn't have anything in mind, it would still be kosher for schach. But it doesn't say, because it doesn't say katana there, the Tosfos seems to want to just learn it more that it's vague. Okay, anyway, that's a different, it's not a difference in halacha, it's just the way Rashi and Tosfos are translating the Gemara. Now, the Gemara gave that answer, and the Gemara said that let's now explain Rabbi Eliezer's view. So when it comes to Rabbi Eliezer, we had a little problem, because Rabbi Eliezer also seems to have the same issue, where he says it doesn't matter if it's big or small. He says it depends what you have in mind. Have in mind for shchiva is one thing. Have in mind for sikoch, it's another thing. If you have in mind for shchiva, it's invalid for schach. If you have in mind for sikoch, it's valid for schach. That's what it boils down to. But he leaves it vague what happens in the middle case. The middle case means the case where you didn't have anything specific in mind. You didn't designate it. So again, the Mishnah leaves out a very important part. So especially because the implication is contradiction from the Reisha to the Seifa, from the first statement to the second statement. It's a contradiction, because the way Rabbi Eliezer starts out, he starts out saying, oh, you have in mind, you designate it for lying on, then it's invalid for schach. What does that imply? That if you didn't designate it, if you just just have it, haven't specifically had in mind anything, so then it sounds like that it's going to be kosher for schach. And then you read the second case is you have in mind for schach, it's kosher for schach. Oh, so if you didn't have anything in mind, it's not kosher for schach. So that's a contradiction. What it implies contradicts itself from the first half of the first sentence, first statement, to the second statement. So again, Rabbi Eliezer also seems to be unclear. So the Gemara says, Rava the Gemara uses the word Ella. Ella Amar Rava. Rather, Rava says, and it changes the whole thing. And what does he want to say? So he says, by a big mat, there's no argument. By a big mat, Kule Alma Loi Pligi, everyone agrees that it's made for sikoch. And you just use your common sense. If it's so big, it's not meant for people to sit on or lie on. If it's small, meaning it's the size of a person lying on, then you could understand that there's room to say it's meant for lying. But it's so big, that's the logic behind it. So it's very big. It's obviously meant for stock purposes, for shade. So when it's big, everyone agrees that stama is for sikoch, and we can't answer like we answered before. He's like changing the answers, and he says the big ones everyone agrees it's always meant for schach, and unless you have something specific in mind, it's so where do they argue? They argue when it's a small mat, and again we said small means the size of a person's height plus a little bit. That would be small, or anything less than that. And the Tanakama holds that a small mat is meant for lying on. Rabbi Eliezer holds that even a small mat is assumed to be used for sikoch, for shade. And then we turned the page and we tried to fit it in.